everyone, I'm Petrus and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've watched our content so far and liked it, please consider liking this video, subscribing and donating on Patreon. Today we're talking with Dr. Wynand Boshoff. Wynand is the son of Carel Boshoff, the founder of Orania, and grandson of Prime Minister Hendrick Verwoerd. Wynand has served as MP for the Freedom Front Plus, representing the Northern Cape since 2019. Before that, he served as a provincial leader for the Vryheidsfront Plus, after attaining his Ph.D. in Educational Sciences from the University of Pretoria. Wynand, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here.
We always like to ask our viewers, the people that we interview that come online to tell a bit of their personal story. I mean, you've had your business, the representation that you do as an MP for the Freedom Front Plus has a unique connection in terms of your family ties that's also had a history with that political party. And in that regard, we kind of want to ask you if you just have some interesting personal stories to share about your grandfather, or perhaps just growing up with a family in general.
Yes, well, that's interesting in a sense that everybody's story is equally interesting. Just not everyone are asked about it, or everyone is asked about it. I was born 4 years after my grandfather was murdered, so I never knew him as a person. I grew up knowing my grandma very well. I was, basically 30 when she died at the age of 99. And then, of course, we grew up with my grandfather had 7 children, 2 daughters and 5 sons, exactly the way of my own family also. My mother and father also had 5 sons and 2 daughters. And all that I could say is that being part of this family and knowing them, we had annual family gatherings for a long time until my grandma also passed away. Bears no reflection to the Hendrick Verwoerd that you would get to know in popular history kind of portrayals. So, my uncles are all very clever men, all very shy also. They may sometimes seem to people to be a little bit blunt because they are not outgoing, spontaneous kind of people. All of them studied in the natural sciences, interestingly enough. I've thought about that. My mother also did. So only my one aunt, she became a social worker, which was my grandfather's first direction of study also, the sociology. In fact, he had been the guy who brought sociology as a subject to South Africa after his studies in America. So, while it was just a family, like any other families with lots of uncles and aunts and cousins and stuff, my mother is the second oldest child of the Verwoerd family. And we grew up in Pretoria. I had basically 2 addresses in my life. The one is in Pretoria until I completed my studies, and then in Orania. I should say my undergraduate studies. Afterwards, I did a master's in sustainable agriculture while living in Orania at the University of the Free State. And later on, I proceeded with my educational studies, which is the most recent I've done. Scaring to think that has been completed 10 years ago already. But in fact, if you would like something interesting for me, there's not much to find. I'm just another guy living in Orania and doing a specific job.
Yeah, no, it's always a scenario of when you look at someone that has perhaps, well-known grandfather, well-known father, that forget that they're also human. They just had a family and it's just a normal family life. So it's important to remember that as well in terms of the greater history story. In terms of that story, there's so many ties between the Vryheidsfront Plus and the National Party and so on to what was known in South Africa as the Broederbond. There was a book that came out in that era called The Super Afrikaners, which goes into detail about, at length to which the Afrikaner Broederbond captured the state. It captured the clergy, the education, the sectors. As someone who saw perhaps just the smallest glimpse of that life, I realized that your grandfather unfortunately wasn't alive when you were alive. But as somebody who may have had some sort of glimpse into that life, what's your opinion of the Afrikaner Broederbond and the veracity of these allegations?
I have a very mixed opinion on the Afrikaner Broederbond. It came into being in 1919, and it was a kind of a, you could say, a social self-defense unit. If in the new South Africa, which used to be new in 1919, which is old now, in that new South Africa, which was very British and, British politically spoken, dominated, and then English socio-culturally speaking. It was definitely not to your advantage to be an Afrikaner. And the invitation which the British Empire used to extend to their colonial subjects was, if you are really fine enough, you can become an Englishman. That's the great compliment we'll bestow upon you. You can become one of us. We don't really regard that what you are as very valuable. But you can leave that behind and join us as the greatest, empire in the universe. And there I should make the little joke about the guy captured in the Anglo-Boer War, and his guard told him, the British Empire is so vast, the sun never sets upon it. And he answered, yes, but the Lord knows he can't trust you in the dark. But I mean, that's the attractiveness of becoming part of this huge empire. Afrikaners, or should I say a section of Afrikaners, specifically decided that is not what we would do. We would like to modernize and develop ourselves economically and culturally by using our own identity, our own language, our own, culture. And that didn't quite count to your advantage if you wanted to enter the higher echelons in business or commerce, whatever, in politics or in government. So the Afrikaner Broederbond was founded as a confidential organization. And I think very often it is like that if something starts as a vehicle for the underdog, it's as if that vehicle doesn't quite notice when it's not the underdog anymore. So it has a kind of an aggressiveness, or a kind of a tendency to show the teeth, even when it's not necessary. I have a little funny story about that. The Broederbond was only for men in the olden days. So evidently my mother was not a member. But my father became the chairman of the Broederbond, I think in 1980 or somewhere there around. And the high school where my older brothers and sisters went had to get a new headmaster. And she returned, my mother was on the management, whatever, what they called it at that stage, but the parent body who would appoint the headmaster. So she returned the evening after the meeting. My father asked, for whom did you vote? And she said a specific person, I won't say the name now. And he said, why? And she said, because he's not a Broederbonder. So that was it was a little bit of a jab at a joke, But when I was in high school, that was indeed my headmaster. So the Broederbond had a way of trying to get its way, to have it their way. But I think the powerful the image that it had as this all-powerful body who decided everything before it was decided, or everything before it was decided in real life, I think it's exaggerated. The Broederbond never had such a huge membership. I think towards the end, when the Afrikaner government was very strong into power, you might have found that people would become members of the Broederbond rather to be served than to serve. But the idea of the Broederbond had been all along to serve. Where our families break with the Broederbond came is when the whole, let's call it reformist kind of politics of P.W. Botha came in, and the idea was that the Broederbond should be one of the agents persuading Afrikaners to reconcile themselves with the new reality. And we were part of the group who said, well, there's actually nothing like power sharing. You can share land, but you can't share power. And let's look at better ways to share the land than the homelands policy, which was evidently not working or not reaching its the goal that was set for it. But we will not be able to share power. It's either going to be on this side or on that side. And I had a little bit of the experience of a family being ostracized. Not in a very brutal way or anything, but my dad used to be the chairperson of the Broederbond, and that was you could say that was an important or a prominent at least position. And then he resigned, and then he had this experience of newsletters going into divisions of the Broederbond telling, you should not associate with this guy, and this is a problem, and that is a problem. Some of it was about ideology, some was just personal.
Yeah.
So that's why I say I have a mixed feeling about the Broederbond. I really think they are held guilty for stuff that they never did, but that they were influential. It has no doubt, and much of what they did, I think, was very good. In terms of the self-help kind of economic development, you could say one important thing is to mobilize your own capital, your own people's capital. So you had Volkskas, which was a little bit a fruit of the Broederbond, not as completely as, sometimes if you look back, things look much more planned than they had in fact been. Sometimes things just happen. And then some people like to say, yes, that's why I planned it all along, but they didn't.
Yeah, they actually claim it.
That's right, yes. So, but if in a certain church board there were prominent Broederbonders, they would suggest that let's take this community's account to Volkskas and not in one of the imperial banks or in the agricultural cooperative or whatever. So there was this kind of collusion of interests. And I think also one of the things is nobody can know everybody. So you have to have some way to judge. That's where stereotypes comes in. And the Broederbond used to have a very high standard, which they kept on living and, morality. So to be divorced was a no-no. You would lose your membership immediately. So people had this idea that, okay, I don't know you, but you are a member of the Broederbond, so I think I know something about that. So it's actually networking.
Right.
Now, that's actually my whole story. The Broederbond isn't very powerful today. It's influential, but it's not what it had been because it can't dish out the sheets anymore.
No, exactly, yeah. But you said it's kind of a social preservation group. Initially, it was started as that against the oppression at that time of the colonial masters in terms of the imperial British Empire. And in the same way, the fundamentals upon which the Broederbond was then founded, the freedom and the purpose, the goal of self-determination, of making your work, your results, your work, that type of scenario, is according to the Vryheidsfonds+'s description, as well, some of their founding principles is that freedom and that determination to make your own work, to make you the benefit of the effort that you put in. So could you perhaps in that regard just elaborate on that and just tell us what are the core principles and policies of the Vryheidsfonds+?
Okay, the basic thing of the Vryheidsfonds is that we say the South African Constitution is devised in such a way that you would think this is a rather homogenic cultural community. There's all South Africa. In contrast to a country like, say, Tanzania after the violence a few years ago, or Ethiopia a little longer ago. Ethiopia under Mengistu also had this notion of there are no sub-ethnic groups, there are just Ethiopians. And then when they had to deal with Eritrea's independence drive, and they couldn't suppress it anymore. Then they re-sought the whole Ethiopian state, saying we have a federation now with different cultural groups in every state, and they give a lot of attention about what about a minority in this state which is a majority in another state. How do you deal with those kinds of things? But it also says if a member state wants to secede, like Eritrea wanted to, how do they go about? So the whole process is in the constitution, and the interesting thing about it is that Ethiopian unity was preserved by that and not dissolved. Because once you could get out, you would think, but do I want to now? Or did I just want to get out because I couldn't? And that's a kind of thing that, in South Africa, well, we have two ways in which ethnicity or cultural diversity are denied. The one is, okay, we are all just South Africans. Now, just to look at that, I would say cultural communities is a primary reality. National borders is a secondary reality. But what we are doing in South Africa is to say the secondary reality, the borders, which is actually artificial, that is the primary reality. And cultural groups should abide by that and put their own identities below that. This whole reconception of South Africa could take many forms. In 1994, it was just Afrikaners who thought that there was any sense in that. Most of the other cultural groups fell in. The Zulus with the IFP in a certain way. They kept most of what you could say a federal character and also a federal practice in the province or the kingdom of KwaZulu-Natal. But for the rest, basically all the people just went for this rainbow. So the Freedom Front was specifically founded as an Afrikaner party, working for Afrikaner self-determination. In the meantime, other minorities has come to us and saying, that what you want for yourselves would actually be nice for us too. So we extended our mission to say we are the self-determination party, not necessarily only an Afrikaner party. That doesn't allude anything to the Afrikaner self-determination we are aiming at. It's just saying we are not the only ones seeing some value in that reconception of South Africa.
Yeah, and the thing that's kind of there's an interesting correlation between the concept of self-determination and identifying the different cultural groups that South Africa has such an incredible diversity of, and then putting them into sort of like a federal type state where these groups can then identify with themselves and their groups, and then also orientate their environment, their borders, according to what's going on within their borders, according to what their cultural practices are. The problem is, or rather the issue that's often raised about this policy from the Vryheidsfront in various documentaries and other forms of media that's been portrayed about the Vryheidsfront is that they say that there's a relation between this type of land reform in terms of a federation system and apartheid, which specifically focused on the segregation of certain communities. It has been portrayed or suggested rather that the Vryheidsfront is striving to portray apartheid in a positive light as a form of federationism rather than segregation, or that it's trying to whitewash history. How exactly would you respond to that in terms of like the correlation that people are drawing between federalization and the apartheid era segregation?
Yeah, let's start by saying that most of the members of the Freedom Front in English, if they are too young, their parents would used to vote for apartheid, for the National Party or the Conservative Party after that. And therefore it would be, in a sense, a little bit artificial and not very credible to say, okay, no, but we don't have anything to do with that. Let's just forget about the past. Of course, one is not going to create a better future by, just delving on the past, but one has to be honest about where you had been and what you were thinking. And the problem that we are, in fact, resisting is the idea that one should, if you are an Afrikaner, accept the narrative of, let's say, the 40 years between 1948 and 1994, let's say that half century.
Yeah.
You should accept the narrative of the ANC as if it is a neutral narrative. That's just history. It's not ideologically colored or anything. It's just the way it had been. While that is not the case, if I listen to my colleagues in Parliament correctly, they would, well, it's not that they would, they do very often say the whole system, which was just geared towards the disadvantage of Africans and the advantage of whites. Now, the problem with the whole story is that apartheid was, in a sense, not in a sense, it was essentially an attempt to maintain minority rule in South Africa. And we should add to that minority rule wasn't a swearing word all over in history. In previous times, the question was who has the most military power, not who has the greatest numbers. So whether it is Shaka Zulu in southeastern South Africa, or whether it was Napoleon in Europe, or Bismarck, or Julius Caesar long ago, they never counted people. The only way, the reason why you would count people is to know how many soldiers you could mobilize. So minority rule had not been a swearing word all along, but it became that. And Afrikaners tried to sidestep the whole, let's say, inevitability of majority rule. And I would say that with the policy of separate development, I mean, the National Party let the word apartheid behind it in the 1950s already. It was actually just reused by Afrikaners while saying sorry. It may be, and I would say it probably is, true that for many people, the whole separate development story was just a nicer word for saying we are not going to give the blacks anything if we could help it. But then there were definitely people in black education, in the service of the homelands, in many other departments, who very sincerely worked to the advantage of black people. But the problem is that it was all geared towards maintaining a white minority rule. And we maintained that far too long. We maintained that to the point that no middle road was possible anymore. If we would have looked at some kind of federal system, if we would have looked at something like saying, okay, every ethnic group has a majority area, but Afrikaners don't, we should constitute a majority area somewhere, and then we have to make that idea a reality by concentrating our numbers, then a federal option could have been credible. But in the minds of most of black South Africans, every word from separate development to good neighborliness to federalism to whatever else we thought of was just another way of not letting them have the power. And then black people also started to identify with a black genetic identity as opposed to ethnic identities, because ethnic identities was identified with divide and rule. So for Afrikaners, in the context of what I mentioned just now, we wanted to develop through our own language and identity. We thought that would be the logic thing for black people also to do, to develop through Setswana or through isiZulu. But the way they viewed that is, you're just busy with the old colonial game again of dividing us so that we are all minorities. And therefore, I think by the 1980s, it must have been abundantly clear that the genetic black identity was a dominant one. The homelands, which was based upon the premise that ethnic identities might develop more importance in people's minds, that had not happened. So the freedom of the Freedom Front is to be is to be found not in a recreation on a smaller scale of minority rule, but in something which was never known in South Africa. And that is a place or places where Afrikaners, by virtue of their numbers, not in spite of their numbers, can dominate an area. Whether it would be smaller or bigger would depend on the numbers to be mobilized. So that's one end of the one part of the Freedom Front's policy. The other part is that Afrikaners live in places where we know we're never going to dominate it politically again. It's not possible. But even there, we think we have a right on Afrikaans schools. We have a right to our cultural monuments and places of interest in the specific area. And I think that, if I could advise the government, they would advance much faster with the transformation of community and the economy. If they could make Afrikaners feel safe by saying, let's say, the city of Polokwane, which we used to call, or still call, Pietersburg, as an Afrikaner community which makes 2 primary schools and 1 high school feasible. So you have it. We're not going to, lodge an attack on that every year. You're safe with that. You have it. Then the Afrikaners in that area would be much more cooperative and say, okay, so how do we have to transform this country? I am safe now. The kind of majority thinking the ANC and the government is employing is that everyone must become part of the majority. Dr. Corneille Mulder, our chief whip, once asked at the nation building conference, now how about minorities? And the relevant minister answered, it's easy, just become part of the majority. So forget who you are, become part of us. Now, that's not what we are aiming at.
But that's a very similar sentiment to the original British sentiment in 1919, right?
Exactly. I think, in a certain sense, you could say South Africa was a segment of the British Empire, and then it became a little empire on its own. And it's as if people who inherited an empire don't really voluntarily give it up. So it was a British Empire, but then Afrikaners got it through the ballot with an interesting type of ballot where only white people could vote, but we got it. And then again, we didn't want to dissolve the empire. There was an attempt with the homelands, which I mentioned just now, but the idea was that at least the economic heartland of Gauteng and other highly developed areas should remain white. And that remain is a very funny word because it wasn't white. But we thought of it as white. So then, because we were not really prepared to give up the empire and get our freedom in an un-empire way, the ANC took over the whole empire. And the ANC is also not going to give up the empire by free will. So that's basically the thing. Maybe, bad government will end the empire. I once thought of, so South Africa, if you want to mention a social construct, then it is the land or the country of South Africa, because it's a line on a map. But what keeps this social construct together? It's power lines. Big power producers in the Mpumalanga Highveld, these days also in the Bushveld at Alisaras Lepalale, and then the lines going to every corner of the country. That holds this country together. And if Eskom fails, and if people are generating their power in a in a decentralized way, every farm, every factory, every house, every church, everything produces its own energy, then the whole idea of South Africa in some way dissolves. The big thing is to say, okay, neither nature nor community can really tolerate a vacuum. So
Yeah.
what are we going to replace this dissolving South Africa with? Otherwise, it might be very much like the Americans succeeding in getting rid of what do you call Hussein,
Oh, yeah.
Saddam Hussein, and then just leaving a lot of chaos
Behind.
in its place. Then
Yeah.
you haven't really reached anything.
Right. And one of these absolutely dividing factors which drive people to, different sectors of the political spectrum in South Africa is, of course, the expropriation without compensation bill that's currently being discussed in Parliament, and I mean in the nation as a whole. And it's kind of, some say it's kind of ironic because this taking of land is actually exactly one of the things that happened in the past. So they kind of see it as a history repeating itself. But just regardless of the morality or the situation around it, what do you think about the legality and the practicality simply of the bill itself?
Okay, it is one of those things that one has to start thinking in the historical context, because otherwise it's inconceivable. And that's also where I would say the narrative of South African history is highly simplified by the ANC exactly to suit itself. Because if it would be a little bit more nuanced, lots of land would also be ceded from South Africa to Lesotho and Botswana and the Kingdom of Eswatini. But they are not going back that far
Yeah.
for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And also the whole history where land was not just expropriated from tribes, but where there were valid transactions taking place. There were wars also, but there were very good relations and valid transactions. And you could say Afrikaners was just another tribe, not strong enough really to subjugate other tribes. The subjugation on a grand scale actually came with the empire, which had the necessary power to do so. We never had it. We like to say at Blood River, when we had the Zulus where we wanted them, we had not had them in any such place. So that's the first thing. The whole expropriation without compensation starts with a very thin narrative of South Africa, which is devised for a specific reason in a specific way. But then I would say South Africa had an economy which completely transformed from the pre-modern economy before 1886. You could also say 1866 with the diamonds in Kimberley.
Yeah.
That's where the modern economy reached South Africa, but it really reached it in a way which extended to every corner of the country with the discovery of gold in Johannesburg. And then you had an economy which was built on the Western model of economic development. Before whites came to South Africa, there was no such thing as title deeds and land ownership regulated by a deeds office. But then this happened, and the whole economy was built on that framework. And what one has to say today is, how do you take this framework and fit it with your own political views and ideals, much in the way that it has happened in Southeast Asia, where countries succeeded, or not countries, nations succeeded in merging their traditional way of seeing things with the Western model of economic development.
Yeah.
And in some, there are many different, you can't say there's the rule. There are many different ways in which that had been done. But that's not what is done in South Africa. In South Africa, the idea, it seems to me, is to keep on taking bit by bit from those who have in order to give the have-nots. And after everything has been depleted to a certain extent, now we have to turn to land. That's the one thing. The other thing is, land is highly symbolic. In Afrikaans, we call everything grond. But in fact, the division between grond and land is very important. Grond, land in that sense, is just a medium of production, and it can be traded and whatever. But ownership of the land is part of one's identity. And that's why Afrikaners realize why it's so important to black South Africans, but it's also important to us. So that is that side to it. Now, if you get to the present situation and you look at the capital markets, the way it works, and how South Africa's economy is structured, then expropriation without compensation will really just pull out the cornerstone out of the whole building.
Yeah.
And it may lean a little bit for a little while, but sometimes it will come crumbling down. So we understand the symbolism, we understand the emotional impact that land has. But you also have to deal with it in a way that will preserve the economy. Otherwise, we can all share our poverty within a few years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good take on in terms of how the history combined and the understanding and the fundamental understanding between the economic benefits of land and the ownership and the identity combination between the two. There's also a very strong identity combination in terms of what you alluded to earlier in the city of Polokwane regarding schools for Afrikaans people and Afrikaans communities that are integrated in certain areas. And there are universities in South Africa who, for the past couple of years, 5 to 10 years, have had a hugely controversial debate on whether or not Afrikaans should be taught in universities. So, I mean, there's definitely the one perspective where you're again feeling like not only schools in Polokwane, but universities all over the country are being threatened in the way that their Afrikaans is allowed to be practiced or not, but also just the kind of slow, almost want to say, degradation of Afrikaans as an academic language, as more and more Afrikaans kids simply switch over to English because it's easier. So how do you feel about, what's your opinion about the legal battle on whether Afrikaans should be taught as a primary language at these universities, and also just the slow degradation, or at least the perception of slow degradation of Afrikaans in these environments?
My father had this saying when we were still in the very early times of Orania, and that was to say that every institution at the end reflects the society in which it functions. So, we were all very loyal tikkies, studied at the University of Pretoria, and really had this feeling of pride. He said, you must know that tikkies will just reflect the society of the Tshwane Metro. And it may be possible to keep it a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, but that's the end of it. That's a destiny. So, in that sense, some of us, people who settled in Orania or grasped the whole idea of Orania, even if not settling here, would say, well, we've come to peace with that long ago. But nevertheless, at the time that I came to terms with it, I was maybe 25, but now my children are at university or had already been in university. Now it's very, it's practical politics for me now. I would say it's part of this whole unifying thinking in South Africa. This nation of South Africa should be English. It's a black nation. Whites will be tolerated if they know their place, but it's an English-speaking nation. Now, I actually don't quite understand it. We have this 9 official languages, which make it impossible for anybody to know all official languages. But if you had a movement at that stage saying, let's create a super Nguni language and a super Sotho language, then it would be possible to know 4 languages. And then you have your vernacular in every area, your Sepedi or your Setswana or your Xhosa or Swati or whatever. but for official purposes. Like in Afrikaans, it's very much differently spoken in Amakwaland and in Pretoria in the eastern suburbs and
And in
in
the Cape.
Stellenbosch, wherever.
Yeah.
So one could have something like that, and that could even have gone over to the tertiary educational sector. But in the end, it was only Afrikaners who really thought, but we have something, we have a legacy in academic research and academic activity which we would like to, to remain.
Mm-hmm.
So the Minister of Higher Education, Dr. Broederbond, he really regards that only as a way of longing to apartheid. You white, you little boors, you didn't, you never really made peace with the New South Africa, and now you want to perpetuate it in little pockets like your universities. I think that's also taking a very thin perspective on the whole issue. And I think we should work on keeping Afrikaans alive in the public universities as long as possible. But that's a transition. In the end, we'll have to take that responsibility upon ourselves. And academia is a very good example of that, with some very relevant degrees being presented by academia already. Of course, if you want to become an industrial engineer, you can't do that with academia already. You would still have to go to Pretoria or to Stellenbosch or Witwatersrand or wherever. But it's a transition. And, it's another little saying that my dad always had. He said there might be an association for saving the rhino, saving the elephant, but there won't be an association for saving the Afrikaner, except if it is being run by Afrikaners. We just have to do it ourselves. So that's, on the one hand, in Parliament, I'm on the Portfolio Committee for Higher Education. I very much argue against the forced Anglicization of Afrikaans universities. But anyone who can count and who has some insight in the ANC knows it's not going to, you can retard the process, but you can't stop it.
Yeah.
And therefore it's more important to work on what we have for ourselves and what we can have for ourselves.
And that holds to the self-determination and the self-preservation nature of the Afrikaans community and the Afrikaans culture. I then also want to relate that to the success of the Freedom Front Plus in 2019, in the 2019 election. It's something that, if you were to look at social media as your only source for political predictions, you would say that the EFF would have, skyrocketed. They could have become the new majority party. And that, well, according to the state, to the votes at the very least, really didn't happen. But what really did come out of left field that people kind of didn't expect, at least in the public media section, was the success of the Vryheidsfront. What exactly did you attribute that success to specifically?
Well, I think there are a number of things, but I'll highlight two. The one is exactly this question about expropriation without compensation.
Right.
It could be in a little bit subconscious way, but the settlement which was reached in 1994 basically said, okay, the ANC is going to take over the government. It hasn't defeated the previous government, so it couldn't take everything, but it would take the government. And then it would guarantee property rights. Now that's the long game, because if you have the government, you can take the economy in time. But Afrikaners really did not see it that way. They thought, okay, now we have this constitutional dispensation which is cast in stone. And not even the angel Gabriel, I don't know what's his name in the English Bible, can change that if he comes, because it's set in stone. We have what we collected in economic terms, we've only given over the government. And that's a settlement which suited Afrikaners very well. Unknowingly, to us, to many of us, because I wouldn't say I didn't realize that, many black people, I would say a majority of black people, thought it was an uncompleted settlement. saying we've settled the economy, the politics, but we haven't settled the economy. That must still come. But Afrikaners clung to this settlement, and in that context, the DA was a very nice party to align with, because it also aligned with the constitutional dispensation. It was just an opponent to the ANC.
Yeah.
So we had this nice dispensation. We just wanted a better government. And the DA could, pretended to be able to give that. While the Freedom Front said, no, we don't want to have a better government. We want to have a better dispensation. So most of the Afrikaners all along said, we're not really all that interested in the better dispensation. We think the dispensation is fine. That's a government we should change. And then came expropriation without compensation, and people said, well, what do you know? The settlement is broken. Indeed, we do need a better dispensation. And that turned people to the Freedom Front away from, well, not many Afrikaners were at the ANC in any case, but away from the DA, which is very much identified with the whole constitution and constitutional dispensation. And then, fortunately for us, and one can't always count on your opponents making errors, but the DA was with his foot in its mouth more often than not during the 2019, in the build-up to the election. And that definitely helped people who had been in doubt to go over to us. And, it could be that the DA could really take a rabbit out of a hat in the following past months. But at present, it really doesn't seem as if they are recovering in any important way.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's also just cost, this way in which the DA, which has been, the main opposition party ever since ever since the forming of the DA as the conglomeration of the Democratic Party and the National Party. I mean, ever since that, they've kind of been this, I don't want to vote for the ANC, but none of the smaller parties is going to be worth my vote, so I'll just vote for the opposition party, which is the DA. And this type of upset in terms of their policy stance and the way that they're handling things is kind of casting a lot of doubt in terms of what the future is for a lot of the smaller parties, because it seems like any of them could now take the official opposition stance that they so successfully had, completely had for the past couple of years. In that regard, what do you see the future of the Freedom Front Plus? Do you see it remaining a minority party? Will it become the main opposition party, or perhaps even reach majority status? Is there a path towards that? And as a side question from my own perspective, I want to know, do you think that the Vryheidsfront Plus would be more successful if it rebranded itself as a classical liberal party with the values of individualism and self-determination and a smaller government?
Yeah. Let's start with the last part. The Freedom Front wouldn't be successful in rebranding itself as the main liberal party because it is not.
Okay.
If you want to label the Vryheidsfront in some way, one could call it a communitarian party, which doesn't put the main emphasis on the individual but on the community, which of course should not be, one should not think it's something like National Socialism where the individual's importance completely is dissolved by the community. It's not what we are saying. But the relevance of the community in the sense that people are what they are because they are born and grow up within communities. And that the community isn't essentially the thing which bounds you up and from which you have to be liberated to reach your true self, or whatever all those terms are, to reach self-actualization. You have to go beyond the community. The community is actually the shoulders on which you stand to reach what you can be. So I think concerning the DA, there will always be a place for a really true liberal party in South Africa, but it will be a small one. And they try to remain liberal at core, but to reach out to as many as possible people and in the end, maybe they lost something of their true identity, but that's their story. Regarding our story, we are working with communities. I would not say that we will become the main opposition party. I think black consciousness and Pan-Africanism in many different forms will keep on crystallizing around, if it's not the EFF anymore, because they may all sit in a very small room thinking about tax evasion, then it will be around something else. But that is the the question which is going to be asked to the ANC. How are you going to deal with Pan-Africanism, which is very prevalent in people's minds? The Freedom Front will keep on representing more communities. As we always used to say, you mustn't think self-determination is just apartheid on a smaller scale. It is essentially something different. But you should also not think self-determination is just a rainbow on a smaller scale. It's also something fundamentally different. I think that future of South Africa will lie much more in a kind of coalition type of politics, in which the Freedom Front will always play a role. You have countries, let's say the Greens in Germany, or some of the religious parties in Israel, which are not very big. They are not one of the main parties, but they have the ability to be the kingmakers. So you would have 2 or 3 main things. They say what is important to us is, well, X, Y, and Z. We discussed it all night, so I don't want to go into that again. So we can support you, but then at least we need this. And especially the whole notion of geographic self-determination. So that Afrikaners, just as an aside, KwaZulu-Natal is a Zulu folk state. Whether the IFP governs or the ANC or maybe the EFF or maybe a new party which we haven't seen yet. And we had all this unrest in the Vembe region about where the border between the Venda-dominated district and the Shona or the Tsonga-dominated district should lie. So all the ethnic groups in South Africa have their main areas. Afrikaners don't. And if we try to establish that, it is regarded as highly racist and, unacceptable. And it's part of the Freedom Front's role to change that mindset, to actually show it as just another manifestation of the variety which we have in South Africa.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the idea that the Afrikaans people are actually quite spread out, where you could almost say that the Northern Cape is the highest concentration of people that speak Afrikaans, but it's not the highest concentration of Afrikaans people. It's a very complex scenario where they don't really have a central geographic location that determines their identity. But we'll talk about that shortly in terms of the story for Orania. I just first want to hit on something else, and that's that it's just kind of, it's a very cruel joke that the general state of Parliament decorum in South Africa is, entertaining would be a nice way to put it, to say the least. But there's so much time that's wasted on, points of order, on apologies. And, there's definitely a sense in the South African public where they just want to know what can be done about this, because the disruptions and the publicity plays by certain political parties is getting kind of old. So I just want to know what is your opinion about what can be done about just the general state of Parliament decorum?
That's a very difficult thing, because the essence of tradition is that everything is not written down. There are some shared ideas of how should it be done. And I've heard that somebody says the whole British or the whole United Kingdom's constitution is it's simply not done.
Yeah.
Now, the decorum of Parliament, what I think of the EFF specifically, it's the nearest that you can get to a Bolshevik party, who will use every rule in order to destroy the whole basis for the rule. they feel nothing for parliamentary rules, for all the all the ideas of checks and balances in that whole setup. But they will use the rules to say 40 of us can each one ask a point of order. And it can't be denied because how do you, speaker, know what I'm going to say?
Yeah.
And then I say exactly what the speaker thought I would say, but he couldn't have known it. So now my neighbor must also have
The chance
the
to.
opportunity. And before I came to Parliament, when ex-President Zuma was the first time disrupted, and we for the first time had the white shirts entering the Parliament and all the violence with that, I just had this this terrible feeling that I can understand authoritarian states, because you can't have that. How can you have that? You should not, those people should be thrown out. And then you rectify yourself by saying, okay, but we can't do it that way. We are, we are democratic people. We can't have it just, throw out those. So, in a sense, I would say, if the voters don't reject it, then it's not going to end. If you want to look at something similar, the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging had some parts of its whole presentation which many Afrikaners found quite attractive and acceptable. And then there was this disruptive element, which just completely swept it from the table, not being taken seriously, not by the ANC or by America or whoever, but by their target supporters who said, okay, no, we don't do it that way. That's not us. If that's not going to happen with the EFF, then this is just going to become worse and worse. And one has this kind of idea that there must be some light in the end of the tunnel, but sometimes there's not. South Africa, the whole setup of South Africa will have to be redesigned at some stage, and everyone has his own idea about how that's going to look like. You might get some right-wingers which say, yes, and that will be the restoration of white rule over the whole of South Africa. Another one would say, well, at least then we won't have any whites anymore because we'll just chase them into the, into the waves. So everyone would have its own idea, but the present South Africa is actually descending into something which at a certain stage will have to reconceptualized from the beginning. And there, I would say, enclaves or areas where things are working and where things are effective and efficient, those will have a disproportionate influence on the whole, how the whole will be reconceptualized once it is done. But, if anybody would, I don't share a very high positivity that the parliamentary system as we know it will mend itself. Actually,
But I do like the perspective saying that it's inherently the voters who choose to have this type of scenario, because it's the voters that vote those type of actions into parliament by allowing them to continue to exist there. You could theoretically say that the reaction of the past election was actually a testament to the fact that the very same voter base perhaps did not believe in the way of disrupting the democracy and the freedom of speech. But it is also very good to say that, it's going to be the voters' choice. And if the voters do decide this, then they actually have a right to stay there, and they should stay there. And you should then work through this in order to come to a result.
What one can say of the EFF is the whole ideology of Pan-Africanism is a very strong ideology in South Africa, but it didn't have a very able vehicle. The PAC or the ZAPU or none of the other movements embracing Pan-Africanism was really good organizations. As you, while you can say the ANC with a charterist kind of thinking, non-racialism, I don't really think non-racialism resonates so well with many African individuals as Pan-Africanism does. But the ANC was a very effective, strong movement, and the PAC had never been that. Now the EFF is that. And well, let's see what's going to happen. Are people going to gravitate more to the kind of charterist, non-racial, that kind of idea, or are they going to gravitate towards a Pan-Africanist view?
Right. So lastly, I just want to talk about the town or city of Orania specifically, because I know that you live there and I know that your father founded the, I don't know, do you classify it as a city or a town?
Well, let's say with a wink, we would say it's a stad.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's because in Afrikaans we would call it a stad, which translates to a city. But so let's say the city of Orania was founded by your father. In a lot of ways, it doesn't actually go out there and advertise itself to the world as like this place where you should go if you share their ideals, and then you should visit it. It exists because the community willed it to be. They wanted it to exist, and because of that, at least from the outside perspective, that's the environment which you're welcome to go to. But then this is the way that things work there. You're not encouraged to go there, or you're not trying to portray this as an amazing place. But see, that's a thing. That's the perspective from somebody that doesn't live there. I want to know from your perspective, what is the core ideas and the drive behind Orania to make it? Do you believe it to be a success story? Do you believe it is something that you want to grow, invite more people to join? Or is it rather just something you think that's working really well in the way that it's currently working?
Yeah, I would say that 20 or 25 years ago, I would have thought Orania would by this time have been much larger than it is. But maybe it's just because I didn't know enough about developmental economics and how hard it is really to get the economy coming up from the ground. On the other hand, had the idea of self-determination and of a specific area where Afrikaners can establish themselves, being part of the settlement of 1994, then Orania could indeed have been much bigger and a much larger town. But the main thing of Orania is to say that if Afrikaners want to govern something, they have to be the majority in that something. And the only way to be a majority is to do your own work. And that is in fact very untraditional for Afrikaners, because Afrikaners spread out like butter over a slice of bread all over the country, living on this substrate of black labor, or in any case not Afrikaner labor. And even thinking that that's the way it should be. And that's exactly what what got to us in 1994. It just we couldn't keep that up. So in Orania we said we have to do our own jobs, our own work, our own menial work, all the unattractive work also, in order to be the majority somewhere. And to be quite honest, that somewhere we could be a majority is now less than 10,000 hectares, and it's maybe 2,000 or 2,500 people. So it's not very impressive in global terms. But it is something that people before said it's not possible. So it's also something which I borrowed from my brother Carel, who at a certain stage said, when Orania was founded, Afrikaners said it's not possible and it's not necessary. Since then, Orania has proven that it is possible, and the ANC has proven that it's necessary.
Yeah.
So what Orania did very well is to grow organically. You could grow mushroom-like, with a huge influx, and then you don't have the infrastructure, and you don't have the economy, and you really can't carry this superstructure, and then it just goes down in a lot of smoke and dust. So we are growing organically, and we have created a reality, and that reality is growing fast. And I can't exactly remember who, but one of these economic management type of gurus or investment gurus said the eighth wonder of the world is compound interest.
Yes.
Now, it works like that with economic growth also. We were tiny in 1991 when we started, but we grew with 10%. And that 10% for 30 years is something rather impressive if you compare it with what it had been. And, even if you could get the momentum to turn that 10% growth to 20% growth, then it will be quite something. So we are, I would say, proud in a very, now I'm looking for the word, what is beskeie in Engels? In a modest way.
Yes.
We are very modestly proud on what has been reached in Orania, because it's not saving the Afrikaner yet. To save the Afrikaner, you should have a university. You should have numbers in which to give people room in where they can reach their potential. But what we have is a very dedicated community which is working to exactly that. And therefore, some people think that Orania is eagerly looking for South Africa to break down. We are not, because this should be a transition. And for Orania to be stable for 100 years, South Africa also has to be stable. We don't have any interest or any profit by seeing South Africa going down in dust.
Okay, well, that's amazing, and it's very good to hear perspective from a resident of itself, because it's just it completely breaks down the almost want to say general narrative that people try to portray as this place that people that don't like the current political situation in South Africa just go and hide away in. And it's not really about that. It's about building your own community sustainably and organically through time, which is better because that means it's there to stay. If, like you said, it grew like a mushroom, it would most definitely, in terms of what history has taught us, go down in flames. But in general, this has been such an interesting discussion. Well, thank you so much. I just want to give you a last opportunity to plug or say something you'd like to.
No, I would just say thank you very much. I often say that the Freedom Front is, in a certain sense, Afrikaners who are freedom-loving. It's their diplomatic corps, or however you pronounce that correctly. Let's call it the diplomatic service. Afrikaners with very, who are conscious about their identity, can be represented in every town council, in every provincial legislature, in the National Party, by way of the Freedom Front. And all people have to do, if they want that diplomatic service, is to vote for us. Then we constitute exactly that. South Africa, as it currently is increasingly becoming an Afrikaner hostile environment. If you look at how many laws were signed in Afrikaans even after 1994, now it won't happen. Many other things. You mentioned the universities. There are many things in which it becomes an hostile environment. Now, if you live in an hostile environment abroad, then you will be sure to know where the nearest consul or embassy is to assist you when you get into some trouble. Now, that's a role of the Freedom Front for the Afrikaner, for some Afrikaners. Of course, there are many Afrikaners who doesn't like what we are doing at all. It doesn't resonate with them, even the least. I don't pretend to talk for all Afrikaners if I say this. But this is our job, and we are glad to do it.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it so much. And thank you for talking to us and taking the time. I just want to say also to our viewers, if you've liked the message that Wynand portrayed and the perspective that he shared, please do share this video with your friends and family and those around you, just to determine to get all possible perspectives about possible worldviews out there and give the people the opportunity to really have a discussion about things from a fair point, not from a general narrative. From our viewers, if you've made it thus far, you've most definitely liked the video as well. If you like it, it gives the channel a lot of support in terms of how it grows and allows perspectives to be shared. And if you want to support us financially, of course, there's also Patreon, but we'll supply all of these links and details in the description below. So thank you so much for watching. This has been WorldView.